you start by telling us how you first got involved in crop circles?
I first got involved back in the late 1980s. I started by seeing a small, short news clipping on television of Dr. Terrence Meaden looking at crop circles. This is like 1988. And I was interested in that. I started reading just about everything there was that was ever written on crop circles. But living here in the United States and going to college here, I didn't ever have the opportunity to go see one until 1996. And at that point, I was at Eastern Michigan University, and I was doing some undergraduate work. I was also teaching a little bit of astronomy at that point, so I was involved with the physics department. And we heard a report of a crop circle in northwest Ohio, a little town called Paulding. And so we decided to take a ride down there. It was a couple hours drive. We borrowed a Geiger counter from the physics department just on a whim to see what we could see. And we drove down to Paulding. It wasn't hard to find it. Everybody in town knew where it was. The newspaper had articles out about it. And so we got to the crop circle. And luckily for us and for several other researchers, the local sheriff was treating it like a crime scene. And so there was yellow police tape up all the way around the circle. It was a single circle about 90 feet in diameter. And it was in wheat. And there was several people who had gone there to check it out already. And two of them were addressing the media when we arrived. And they were saying that it was a hoax circle. One of them was an agronomist from Ohio State University. He arrived about 10 minutes before I did, according to people who were there, and that he walked into the circle, looked around, and declared that it was man-made. He hadn't really done anything but just sheer observation. So when I arrived, I talked to the local police and said, has anybody, measured for radiation or anything like that? And they said no. And I said, well, I'm from the physics department up at Eastern Michigan University. Can I go in there? I have a Geiger counter with me. And they let me pass the police tape. So I started taking measurements from the outside edge and working my way towards the center. And this particular Geiger counter that I had an audible click to it. And so I got about halfway across the circle towards the center, making measurements every 5 feet or so. And one of the media people, a local reporter, noticed me. And as these two gentlemen were addressing the media, telling them that's a hoax, this media person said, well, then what's that guy doing? And everybody spun around to look at me, and I said, if you think it's a hoax, then why am I picking up increased radiation? Which I was. That it turns out that in that particular circle, there was kind of an increase in radiation from the normal background, about 2 to 10 times the normal background level. And it was kind of peaked, or it was a higher concentration of it, in kind of a donut-shaped area that extended 8 feet from the center and then about 10 feet from the edge. So there was kind of a ring of increased radiation. Now, there's no possible way that any hoaxer smashing down wheat with a board or a garden roller can generate radioactivity that can last for days. It's just not possible. So from that little bit of data alone, the agronomist decided that he better take a closer look at what he was looking at. He got down on his hands and knees. He grabbed some plants from the circle and then left quickly. Later on, he produced a report based on almost no evidence to, again, say that it was man-made. I vehemently disagree with that because of that work that I did. But also, plant samples were collected by W.C. Levengood, and he showed that there were elongated growth nodes to that wheat there. And that's the only peer-reviewed published scientific test to determine whether a crop circle is man-made or not, is to look at the growth nodes and that elongation that takes place. So that circle had that, and it had this increased radioactivity. So from there, one of the people I met while I was actually in the circle was a gentleman named Roger Sugden, who at the time was an assistant state director for Indiana MUFON. And Roger and I exchanged contact information, said, hey, if you ever see another circle, we'll give each other a call. And turns out about 5 days later, he gives me a call and says there's another one about 60 miles to the west. And it was an enormous pictogram about 700 feet across. And so we went there. We also measured for radioactivity in that, detected radioactivity about the same, 2 to 10 times the normal background. We collected samples from that. Levengood showed that also had elongated growth nodes there. And from then on, throughout the rest of that summer, we went to several other circles within, 100-mile radius or 150-mile radius of there. And so we've been looking at circles in the U.S. ever since. So that's kind of how I got my start.
Great. Can you talk to us about your methodology? The ICCRA approaches things a little differently from your average researcher. Can you talk us through that?
Sure. The ICCRA has a kind of protocol that we follow when we go out to look at crop circles. We have refined that protocol over the years. We've added tests, we've refined tests to make them more accurate. And so one of the things that we have a little motto that we talk about, no one researcher can set themselves up as any authority. I'm not an authority on crop circles. What we say is that the data is the only authority. And so whatever conclusions that we come to is based strictly on the data that we collect. We tend not to go out on a speculative limb as much as we can. Speculation is great for trying to test out new methodologies, but if you're just talking about an opinion, we try to stay away from opinions and we try to stick to what evidence there is. So that's a little bit different than a lot of researchers are doing these days. What we tend to do is we do several different scientific tests whenever we go to any crop circle formation. We try to look at each one objectively, and we'll try to make a determination as to whether one is man-made or not man-made. And we do that using these different scientific tests. I told you the one main one is the node elongation test, in which W.C. Levengood was able to get peer-reviewed and published back in the 1990s. So we have taken that protocol and we've actually refined it to make it more accurate. We've added some refinements to it, such as not including any stalks that have more than a 10-degree bend to them. And the reason that we do that is because within 48 hours of plants going down, there is a natural recovery process that begins to take place. And in that natural recovery process, you can see some node elongation taking place. So we eliminate that by only using plants that don't exhibit that effect. So that's a refinement to Levengood's original methodology. So we've just tried to make them as accurate as possible. We will measure for radioactivity. We typically use a Gamma Scout. It measures for alpha, beta, and gamma. And we will measure for changes to the electric field strength of the area. We'll measure for changes to the magnetic field strength of the area. We'll even measure for microwave radiation and combinations thereof. We do use equipment that filters out man-made sources of electromagnetic radiation, so that it helps us to not get some kind of spurious source. What we have found is that in formations that we determine to be not man-made, they have to have that node elongation analysis test done that shows that there was node lengthening. Or in the case of soybeans, which don't have growth nodes, we look for other specific damage that has been exhibited in soybean plants along the stems of the plants where they connect to the branches. So we look for those specific plant changes, and we do a great amount of statistical analysis to make sure that populations that are in the flattened areas are different from the plants that are still standing out in the field. So we try to cover all our avenues. The magnetic field and electric field measurements that we do, as well as the radiation that we can detect, all of those changes that we see inside crop circles don't seem to last past 10 days after the initial event occurs. We've never found them in a formation past 10 days. We've actually been at a crop circle using the Gamma Scout, which has an electric, kind of onboard reader that saves all of the data. It takes a continually running number of radiation measurements at whatever rate we decide to set it at. And it stores that data on board, and then we download it to our computer later. And we set that up in a particular formation in North Carolina that we went to in 2005, and we got there on the 9th day. And we let it run through into the 10th day, and we watched the radiation go from a higher level right down to back to the normal background. So for whatever reason, 10 days seems to be about the time that those effects seem to last. And we only see those changes, earlier than 10 days.
Looking at the data you've gathered over the years, what is some of the most surprising stuff you've found? Without trying to color it too much, but
that is a very interesting question. I tend not to be surprised by hardly anything. So finding incidents of higher radiation or electromagnetic field changes, things like that, doesn't surprise me. It's very interesting, and we can document that. Probably the most surprising result that we've looked at recently is in mapping the crop circles accurately. I started to undertake this project about 2 or 3 years ago, where I started creating maps of where all the crop circles have come down. We actually look at a lot of different aspects of the crop circles, and so that was one aspect that we tried to understand better, is what context crop circles are coming down in. Are there other things in the immediate area that we might be able to find a pattern to that would give us some insight into where crop circles are coming down? And so I started working on a project to map them accurately. And I started using Microsoft Map Point, and I created a map that showed generally where all the circles were across the United States. That gave us a little bit of an insight that crop circles weren't coming down everywhere and anywhere. They were coming down in specific areas, kind of clusters of areas that were interesting. So that was kind of the first step of that process. Second step of that process began as mapping technology got to be a little bit better. I did some GIS work at Eastern Michigan as a graduate student. I worked on a grant for NASA on the Lunar Prospector mission, where I mapped data from Lunar Prospector. Was looking at neutron spectrometer data from reflected off the moon to look at elements in the crust of the moon. And we developed a process to map that to the surface of the moon. So I had some background in doing GIS work and mapping, and so I started to think about how best to approach that. And about the same time, Google Earth was launched. Google Earth makes things very easy to map, and you can import sets of data into that program so that you can map things accurately. So I started doing that. I started to map the formations both in terms of their placement, but also to get their orientation correct in the landscape. And so I started to import aerial photos into the program to get their proper orientation in the landscape. And one of the things I found in looking at a couple of formations here in Ohio was that one formation seemed to point exactly to another formation. There was a formation in Miamisburg, Ohio, that all of the circles seemed to sort of line up with one another and point to a nearby Indian mound called the Great Miamisburg Mound. But there was one circle in that formation that seemed to be offset from the main alignment of all the rest of the circles. So if you drew a line from the tip of that formation through that offset circle and just extended that line, it extended about 60 miles away and went right through the center of another crop circle that we looked at in Bainbridge, Ohio. And that was surprising. And we knew that the Bainbridge crop circle itself was also pointed to a nearby Indian mound. And it had sort of three arms to it. One of those arms had a triangle in it that pointed right to this mound called Sipe Mound. And one arm, which had a circle through the center of it, was on an alignment of 4 different crop circles, essentially, across the landscape. There were 4 crop circles that came down in 2003, 1 in Kentucky and 3 in Ohio, that all lined up on a straight line across a map, for instance. And so that line went right into that crop circle. And then we had this other alignment from the Miamisburg crop circle. But the third arm had some straight line geometry to it. And I wondered if I just extended that straight line geometry, where would that point? If these other things pointed to something, maybe that third one would point to something, and it did. It turns out that it pointed all the way back to the very first crop circle I looked at in Paulding, Ohio. It went 160 miles straight through to the center of the Paulding crop circle. And so I started to examine every single crop circle here in the United States that I had good mapping data for. And it turns out that every single crop circle that we've determined to be non-man-made that has a straight line geometric component to the formation, that straight line geometric component points exactly to another crop circle here in the United States. And in many cases, some circles are referenced by others multiple times. And some circles reference or have alignments up to as many as a dozen other crop circles that they point to. And they're very exact. In some cases, the straight line points exactly to another straight line component of another formation as much as 2,000 miles away. It is amazing and very surprising. And so that's probably the most surprising thing that we've found over the years.
One of the things we've noticed in England, and you're telling me here as well, is the crop circles continue to reference these ancient mounds, whether it is Silbury Hill, West Kent Long Barrow, or the Serpent Mound. Why do you think that is?
One of the things that we've looked at over the years, one of the results that we found is that crop circles don't come down anywhere and everywhere. They seem to come down in a landscape that has certain contextual features to that. In a 99% of all of the non-man-made crop circles that we've looked at here in the United States, 99% of them have 3 similar contextual components in the landscape. One is that they come down on the downslope or the very bottom of a hill or in the lowest part of the field. 99% of the cases, they come down near some body of water, creek, pond, drainage ditch, river, right over the top of an aquifer, but there's some water component involved. The third circumstance is that they're coming down in very close proximity to power lines. And in about 85% of the cases, the closest power line pole to the crop circle has a transformer box on it. Not all power line poles have transformer box on it, so that's an interesting observation. The fourth component that we see is that in about 65% of the cases here in the United States, the crop circles are coming down in very close proximity to Native American mounds or earthwork sites. And so in that case, we're seeing a very similar circumstance to the ancient landscape in England as we see here in the United States. Most people are generally unaware of the ancient earthworks that have been constructed here in the United States, but they are, in comparable size, in comparable design to a lot of the earthwork features that you see in England, for instance. There are conical burial mounds here in the United States, just like conical burial mounds in England that they call round barrows for, just different terminology. There are hilltop earthworks in England like Barbary Castle. We have hilltop earthworks here in Ohio. There's places like Fort Hill and Fort Ancient and Spruce Hill. Those are all hilltop earthworks that are constructed in a very similar fashion to places like Barbary Castle in England. So we see similar types of earthworks in an ancient landscape here in Ohio, and so there may be a component that is shared between the two kinds of crop circles. My sort of leading hypothesis about that is that crop circles are coming down in places that have an unusual electromagnetic field property in the landscape. One of the things that has been found in a lot of Native American earthwork sites and other earthwork sites around the world is that they also have an unusual electromagnetic field property surrounding them. A lot of people have documented that, Paul Devereaux, John Burke, and others that have done great work to document those changes. So if you think about why people would construct these ancient sites in the place in which they did, it may be that without our modern day sort of electromagnetic smog that we all live in, that is everywhere, we become desensitized to changes in our local magnetic field and electric fields, but ancient peoples may not have. And so they may have felt a change. They might have, decided to act upon that feeling and say, there's something special about this. It's different. We're going to put our monument there. I just as a guess, I think that may be the case. And that may be the reason why we're seeing both of them come down in such close proximity to one another.
You mentioned MUFON briefly. Is there a misconception that crop circles are uniquely formed by UFOs?
Well, there is an overwhelming feeling in both the popular media and in a lot of researchers that UFOs are making crop circles. There is a acute lack of evidence for that. One of the things that is very little known is that there have been eyewitnesses to crop circles forming. There have been at least 50 eyewitnesses to crop circles forming. And in none of those eyewitness circumstances do any of them report seeing a UFO actually make the crop circle. There have been many, many circumstances of people reporting unusual balls of light after the crop circle is already there. And what those balls of light are is anybody's guess at this point, but that may or may not have anything to do with the crop circles at all. For instance, in England, the famous Golden Ball Hill dates back for centuries. Those golden balls that people have been seeing may or may not have anything to do with the crop circles being there. We just don't have evidence for that, and so there's a real lack of evidence to show that crop circles are being made by UFOs. To give you an example, the most recent documented eyewitness was actually here in the United States back in 2003, a gentleman by the name of Art Rentella. And Art Rentella lived in Wisconsin, and he was used to getting up early in the morning. He was a recently retired truck driver, and he got up early in the morning, turned on his television to check out the weather, noticed that there was going to be a severe weather front that was going to be passing by his area that morning, and he's somewhat of a weather aficionado, so he decided he would go out to his workshop, which sits on the top of a hill, and watch the weather go by, essentially. And about 7:30 in the morning, the weather front hit his location. He noticed at first the bark start coming off the tree nearby to the window of his workshop. And he looked across the street, and the trees were swaying violently back and forth. And then he directed his gaze down the hill, across the street to a wheat field, where he watched as 3 crop circles formed. A first circle swirled down, then a second one, then a third one. And the whole thing took place within about 12 to 15 seconds. He saw no unusual lights. He heard nothing unusual, no unusual sounds, no UFOs present. The only thing that was unusual was the passage of this weather front. And in most circumstances, most of the eyewitnesses report the same thing. And in this particular case, Art Rentella's case, this particular crop circle actually had some geometry to it. It's not just simple circles, but it actually had some sophisticated geometry to it. So he's actually the first eyewitness documented to a pictogram-type crop circle coming down. But again, unless the UFO was invisible, he didn't see it. So
you bring up the weather. That's very interesting because we do see correlations between lightning strikes and the sacred mounds. Does that include crop circles? Have you found anything interesting there? Looking at the weather, obviously, other than what you just mentioned.
Dr. Terence Meaden was the first one to really identify a correlation between the weather and crop circles. He was an atmospheric physicist, and he, came up with first an idea that whirlwinds might be making crop circles. Later on, as more data came in, he modified his hypothesis to say that plasma vortexes that were making crop circles, some sort of electrically charged plasma that was in a vortex component was making them. Whether or not that's the case or not, it's a good hypothesis at this point. In terms of other weather, one of the things he did document in a couple of circumstances was that around the time that they could pin down when formations occurred, that there were changes to the local barometric pressure, that there was at least a microfront that was passing, if not a major front that was passing. Now, fronts carry with them an electrical charge change, as they pass. And it could be that may be like a trigger mechanism to understanding why crop circles come down. For a while, if you think about the contextual components that I described that we find in each circumstance of a non-man-made crop circle. You have on the downslope of a hill or at the bottom of a hill, you have the local water nearby, you have power lines nearby. Each one of those, in and of themselves, creates a difference in charge in the local landscape, electrical charge in the local landscape. You can go out and measure a difference in charge from the top of a hill to the bottom of a hill. There's just going to be a difference in electrical charge. when you have running water or you have an aquifer, say, for instance, as the water moves through the local land, it will strip ions away from the local, immediate soil, and you generate essentially a difference in charge. Obviously, power lines have a difference in charge running through them, and where transformer boxes are, they're obviously a huge difference in charge. And what you do then is set up a place where you have a whole series of charge imbalances in a landscape. And it could be that you need a trigger mechanism like the passage of an electrical front, say, for instance, that could cause a cascade of changes to stop that imbalance from taking place and to even that out. That could be part of the process that crop circles, one source cause could be created by. I think that one other component to consider, a couple of years ago, I was contacted by the National Weather Service because one of the roles of the National Weather Service in the United States is to document the intensity of tornadoes whenever a tornado is reported. And there are more tornadoes reported in the United States than any other country in the world. How you do that is you actually have to go to the site of where the tornado touched down, and you make a series of physical measurements of the damage that took place. So they can calculate the intensity of the wind speed throwing like a 2x4, for instance. They can see what the impact was, and they can calculate all of that. And so they back into, well, that was a particularly intense tornado, and they rank that on a scale, a Fujita scale of 1 through 5, and that just refers to the intensity of the tornado. So they're used to seeing damage in the landscape, but they called me because they came across a field that had a tornado go across it, in which case they found the normal tornado track, but adjacent to the tornado track in this cornfield, they found what they called unusual damage that they'd never seen before. And that damage really was flattened corn like we see in crop circles. So one of the things that I suggested to them to take a look at was they have access to what's known as the National Lightning Detection Network Array. And it's a series of sensors that are set up across the United States that measures wherever a lightning strike occurs. And they can pinpoint exactly where that lightning strike happens. And they can also tell sort of the polarity of it, positively or negatively charged. And so that for the time frame in which this tornado went past this field, they looked at the data set from the National Lightning Detection Network Array. They looked at it on a minute-by-minute basis for the 15-minute time frame that the tornado passed by this field. And what they saw surprised them because in most circumstances, the overwhelming amount of lightning strikes are negatively charged. But in this circumstance, more than 60% of the lightning strikes that occurred were positively charged. And that is quite unusual. They'd never seen anything like it before. Now that is an interesting correlation, that there are all these positive electrical strikes that are taking place in the area in which this was found. It doesn't mean that it was responsible for it, but it's yet one more unusual thing to tack on to the amount of unusual things that we find surrounding crop circles. So I think that it's worth pursuing further, and it may lead us to more insight about why crop circles are forming where they form.
So the lightning, does it actually strike more often around these mound areas or around where crop circles are found?
There are ancient reports of lightning strikes hitting mound sites, the world over. Here in the United States, there are reports dating back to the early 1700s. In fact, there was a president of the United States early on, before he became president, was actually responsible for an army that was to clear out Indians in the state of Ohio. And one of the first places he came to was Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati, before it was a city, was actually an ancient place that had lots of mounds and lots of geometric mounds to that. And one of the mounds, a very tall conical mound, which had a ditch around it, a moat around it, so to speak, this former president wrote in his notes that the Indians would erect a pole on the top of the mound, and that when lightning would strike the pole, they would rush in to drink the water because they felt that the electrical energy gave the water healing properties. And it's a fascinating sort of insight into the early practices that may have, something to do with why did they construct certain mounds the way they did, was actually to possibly draw in the lightning, as a component. There are certainly mythologies that tend to support this throughout North America and actually around the world. One of the most ancient of mythologies surrounds the Thunderbird. And here in Ohio, one of the sort of cosmologies of the ancient peoples was that there were essentially like three levels to the world. There was the plane of existence that we live on, and then there was the upper sky world, which was ruled by the Thunderbirds, and then there was the lower underworld, which was ruled by the Great Horned Serpent. And the Great Horned Serpent and the Thunderbird were diametrically opposed to one another, and in all the mythologies, they seek out to try and kill one another. And so these forces, were to remain in balance, essentially. And we see, that thunder mythology, that Thunderbird mythology, take place. One ancient mythology story that has come to us here in the United States dates back to the 1840s. There was a gentleman by the name of Henry Schoolcraft who was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and his job was to go out throughout the western states and collect information about the practices of the Native Americans. And one of the stories that he collected was entitled The Magic Circle in the Prairie. And the very first couple of paragraphs about this story was of a Native American walking through the prairie grass and coming upon a flattened circle ring, actually. And he goes on to have all kinds of magical adventures. But that in the description of the ring, it said that it was as if the plants were trod upon, but that there were no pathways leading out to it. So there are a couple of instances where this mythology, this same story, has been repeated through many different Indian tribes across the continent, meaning that the original story probably dates back quite a ways. It's been found in at least 3 or 4 different Indian tribal legends at this point. The earliest reference I found to a crop circle here in the United States dates back to 1820, in which it's kind of an interesting story related to that Native American legend. There were 2 Indian tribes that were getting together out in Missouri to sign a peace treaty, and the local U.S. military fort was going to play host to this signing of this peace treaty. And one of the Indian tribes was the Osage, and they were selected to provide a priest to go out and perform a specific ritual prior to the signing of the peace ceremony. And there was a Christian missionary at the time who was at the fort who accompanied this Native American shaman priest from the Atmosphere clan to go out into the local prairie to conduct this ceremony. And what he did was the shaman and his assistant and the missionary went out and before dawn, and the shaman and his assistant constructed a flattened circle in the prairie grass. And the missionary asked him why they did this prior to doing this ceremony. And he said it was the universal practice of all of the Native American tribes to do this because this flattened circle in the grass was a representation of God. That's the missionary's term. And so it could be that you have the earliest instance of a hoax crop circle essentially being made or a man-made circle being made, but that the practice seems to have been that the Native Americans were mimicking what they had seen in earlier times, and that it was universally recognized that it was coming down from, now the missionary used the term God, but if you think about the Native American cosmology, it was more likely the Thunderbirds that were responsible. And so you have that connection. Again, the priest that was chosen was selected from the Atmosphere clan to do it. So there's this unusual sort of theme of repeating throughout each of these stories that seems to make some sense.
Am I correct in assuming that the Thunderbird Mound is actually the oldest mound in America?
Which one?
The Thunderbird. There is a mound, is there not, up Michigan way that is in the shape of a Thunderbird?
There are lots of effigy mounds throughout the United States. Effigy mounds are a much later construction of mound type than the earliest mounds. The earliest mounds in the United States date back about 4,000 years, and they were constructed down in the southern part of the United States. Here in Ohio, the earliest ones that were constructed date back to about 800 BC. And they were mostly conical mounds, very large conical mounds. Around 0 AD, around the time of Christ, maybe as early as 100 BC, there was a culture here that began constructing geometric earthworks. Large-scale geometric earthworks, as big as a city type of a thing. And those geometric earthworks we find across the state of Ohio and into some of the surrounding states. Then it's not until sometime later that we see effigy mounds being constructed. And most effigy mounds are in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. There are a few in Illinois and a few here in Ohio, but not very many at all.
Let's talk about fertility a bit. In the data you've gathered, what have you noticed about how the fertility of the plants is affected in a crop circle? And of course, when I say in a crop circle, I mean a real one.
Well, the ICCRA hasn't really done any specific studies regarding fertility of the soil or the plants themselves, but we do work with W.C. Levengood, who has done some of those studies. And what he has found is that there's actually a big misconception about the kind of fertility that you see in non-man-made crop circles. It's quite dependent upon the age of the crop and what kind of crop it is and what the moisture content is. But what you generally see is that you can see about a 20 to 30% increase in the yield the year following a crop circle in the same location.
Hold on a
Sure.
Can I we all check on that if you want?
Start over, I guess. Whenever you want.
Well, I
Tell
was
me.
laughing because I heard that guy's voice again.
Yeah.
You can go whenever you'd like.
Okay.
Well, so
The ICCRA hasn't really done a lot in terms of studies of fertility in the soil or the plants. We've worked with W.C. Levengood in the past, who has done a number of those studies, in which case he has found that in the past, non-man-made crop circles seem to show that the following season there may be 20 to 30% increase in yield in the soil. So whatever crop comes up the next year in that area is 30% better yield. He's also done germination studies to show that crop circles, depending on the age of the crop when it went down and the moisture content of the crop, it can be quite variable, but that you do tend to see an accelerated growth rate in those germination studies. In fact, he was able to patent a device with John Burke, a physicist, to replicate that effect, where they expose seeds to an electromagnetic field for some period of time, and they can replicate that 20 to 30% better yield, faster growth rate. I think there was one company in Illinois that is experimenting with it. In fact, Burke has written an interesting book called Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty, in which he talks about some of his experiences in doing similar studies with seeds that were taken to ancient sites around the world, places like Stonehenge and Serpent Mound here in the United States and others, where they would put the seeds on the mound or in the ancient site, expose them to that area for some period of time, and then they found the same exact kind of accelerated growth rates in doing their germination studies to what they saw at crop circles. One member of the ICCRA, Dr. Charles Lietzau, who's a biologist that we work with, he replicated that study at Serpent Mound, where he took wheat seeds out to and placed them on the mound. He kept a control sample in the car in the parking lot at Serpent Mound, and he also kept a third control at his lab back in Michigan. And then he germinated all three, and he found that he got this accelerated growth rate in the germination from the seeds, both on the mound and in the sample that he left in the car in the parking lot at the mound. So it was necessarily not tied to the mound itself, but in the area surrounding it. So we saw that increased fertility like that.
Let's talk a bit about Serpent Mound since we're there. You mentioned crop circles are often aligned to it.
Just one specifically.
Oh, okay. One specific, that's certainly different. We talked a little bit about what's unusual about it. It's in a crater. Can you go into that a little bit? And the gravitational anomaly, that's very interesting.
Sure. The crop circle that came down near Serpent Mound back in August of 2003 was aligned on its major axis with Serpent Mound, which was a couple of thousand feet away. It went right through the head of the serpent. Now, you couldn't see the serpent from where the crop circle was or vice versa because there were a lot of trees in the way, but nevertheless, it was still aligned to it. Now, Serpent Mound is an ancient mound site which has a lot of astronomical alignment information sort of encoded into it, much in the way of Stonehenge years ago was decoded by Dr. Gerald Hawkins from Harvard University or Boston University to be aligned to certain risings and settings of the sun and moon. Well, Serpent Mound not only has that, it actually goes a step further. It's the only ancient site known in the world that incorporates all of the key lunar risings and settings of the 18.6-year lunar cycle. It has all of the major solar cycles of both the equinoxes and the solstices, risings and settings. It also seems to encode certain planetary alignments, say of the setting of Venus. And it also seems to be laid out across the landscape like the ancient constellation of Draco, which was a circumpolar constellation that a few thousand years ago was actually where the North Celestial Pole was. So where Polaris is today, where the whole world sort of spins around that axis, it was actually pointed in Draco a couple of thousand years ago at the time the pyramids were built. So it's the only site that incorporates lunar, solar, planetary, and celestial alignments in one design. It's just an absolute genius piece of work. And on top of that, it's not just like a circle, it's actually a sculpture. It's shaped like a serpent, and it was built in the shape of a serpent. So it's a pretty sophisticated piece of work, and was built, at an unknown time frame, more than 1,000 years ago. The crop circle came down literally across the street. What is also interesting about the area is that both Serpent Mound and this crop circle are actually inside of a meteor impact crater. The meteor that struck this area created a 5-mile wide impact crater about 200 million years ago. So the impact fractured the bedrock, the Peoples Dolomite, across the entire area into a whole series of faults. And it created a gravitational anomaly in the area because it fractured the rock about 6 miles deep. So the surrounding area doesn't have those fractures, and so the density of the rock is different. So create a gravity anomaly, which has been mapped out. There's scientific studies that show that. And it also created an electromagnetic field anomaly, actually several within the crater. There are 2 magnetic highs and a magnetic low that have been mapped out within the 5-mile crater. So there are very unusual properties that are detected in and around this area. The interesting thing to note about the crater is that where it sits in the landscape was, if you stand on the southern rim of the crater and let's say the southwest rim of the crater and look out at Serpent Mound, which is in the southwest part of the crater, you look towards the north. On the other side of the crater, you can see the whole crater from the southwest rim. On the northern side of the crater is a hilltop earthwork called Fort Hill. It's another large-scale earthwork feature. And just to the north of that is where the glaciers stopped during the last ice age. So there were archaic peoples that date back to this time that lived in North America and lived in Ohio at that point. And so it literally was the last place on Earth you could go going north before hitting 2 miles of ice. And so it was probably, just as a guess, long considered to be a special place, because here you are walking across the landscape and all of a sudden you come to a big giant circle in the ground, and that marks the end of the Earth, essentially, 12,000 years ago. So it's a very special and interesting place for a lot of reasons.
Let's move on. I'll ask this question to most researchers, especially the ones I like. How do you think crop circles have changed your life in any way since they came into it?
In what sense?
Do you feel like your worldview has enlarged or shrunk, or how has reality changed now that crop circles exist in it?
When I first started looking at crop circles, like most people, you have a pet theory or a pet idea about what may or may not be responsible for creating them. And I've learned over the years that, a lot of researchers will tell you the same thing, is that you tend to find information that changes that idea very quickly. And I've come to the point where I really am now reliant upon the data to tell me what direction to follow, because there really is no evidence to support anybody's particular hypothesis about what is making crop circles at this point. A lot of people have a lot of speculative ideas and opinions, but nobody has enough information to support that. Now, on the flip side, there have been a lot of things that people have learned about crop circles that have led them to insights into other fields of study. Most people, when they come to the study of crop circles, they come from a particular background and they have some body of knowledge that they bring to it, whatever academic discipline or interest that they have. And what you tend to find is that they end up making insights into their own discipline of study from what they find in looking at crop circles. And if you think about that, that's particularly interesting. I can think of examples in music and in geometry and mathematics and in biology in which that's the case. And I've given several lectures about just this particular idea, in which it seems as if over the course of the last couple of decades that no matter what discipline you come from, whether it's art or music or geometry or whatever discipline, they all seem to be converging upon one same insight. And whatever that main insight is about crop circles, we all seem to be hitting around the edges, but we haven't gotten to that central insight yet. So I think that the big insight is yet to come.
Sounds like you're saying almost crop circles could be a primer for a unified theory of some kind.
Well, I don't know. Do you know anything about E3?
No.
Okay. I don't know if I want to go into that. But there is a mathematical breakthrough that occurred last year, which seems to be a sort of unified mathematical theory. It's been kind of nicknamed E3 for the mathematical equations that do it. The guy that figured it out is sort of a surfer physicist. He's an interesting character. But what he has found is that all of the sort of different aspects within the standard model of physics come together into this E3 mathematical equation, which is all based on very intricate geometry. And depending on how you rotate it, you get a lot of the same geometries that you see in crop circles. And that's something that has yet to be very well explored. I started to take a look at it last year, but the math is a little bit over my head, and I used to teach physics and astronomy. So the geometry is very similar, and what's interesting to note about his ideas is that it's very symmetrical work, and there are places in the symmetry that seem to be holes in the standard model. So there are places that could be filled in by using his mathematical models. So it'll be interesting to see where that leads.
So it's based on geometry.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I could send you a diagram or just look up E3. It's a very, very complex piece of geometry, and it's very pretty to look at, too.
And it's about how it's oriented.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we were just talking to Nicola Romansky about, the orientation. I'm sorry, very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move along. We could spend an hour on each one of these.
3 minutes.
Okay. What do people need to know at home about crop circles? People who think this is just a joke, what would you say to them?
One of the things that people need to know about looking at crop circles is that every single person out there has the ability to go out there and detect whether or not it's man-made or not. All you need is a simple ruler. That's as easy as it gets. You can go out there and take your ruler and measure the growth nodes on the wheat stalks, make 31 measurements inside the flattened area and make 31 measurements outside the flattened area, and that's the minimum statistical number that you need to get a population difference. And you can tell literally within an hour or two, as long as you've got a ruler, whether or not the crop circle is man-made or not. That's how simple it is. Most people don't know that. Most researchers don't know that, or otherwise they might apply that methodology pretty quickly. But for the general person that is just inundated with the media mythology about crop circles, that most of them are hoaxes. That may be the case in England. Most of them may be hoaxes in England. But that's not the case all the way around the world, and it's certainly not the case here in the United States. Over the last 5 years, for instance, what we've seen is that about 1 out of every 5 crop circles that we look at has been man-made. 1 out of every 5 crop circles that we look at is clearly and demonstrably not man-made, based on the scientific data that we collect. The other 3 out of 5, we don't get to them in time to be able to make that determination, so they are undetermined. But there are a population of them that are not man-made. So what the source cause of those are is entirely unknown. We can tell a lot about what the changes to the plants are or the changes to the area are based on the different scientific measurements, but that doesn't tell us what the source cause is, and that is still the unknown. And so what I would tell people is that really crop circles are still a mystery as to what is creating them.
Have you ever noticed any physical effects stepping into a crop circle?
Yes. I would say most researchers that have been around inside and around crop circles have anecdotal stories to tell about various effects that have happened to them. I've had my share. Most people that I've been to crop circles with in the ICC area have had their share. And they change from circle to circle. You get different things that you can feel, and different physical effects that happen to you depending on the nature of that individual circle. But I don't think I need to go into any particular story.
While we're on anecdotal stories, any healing you've heard of? Any beneficial?
Only one unconfirmed report. There was a story written in a magazine, sort of a New Age magazine here in the United States, down in Tennessee a couple of years ago, in which there was a report of several circles in Kentucky. And the people who are involved have declined to come forward to confirm the story or not. So it's just hearsay at this point. But the story was that this crop circle formation came down in a farm field. A number of people went out to examine it, a number of locals. They were out in the farm field when they noticed that there was kind of an electrical discharge glow coming from around their hands. And then as they were standing there, showers of sparks started coming out of their hands. And right adjacent to them, another crop circle swirled down. And one of the people had that was involved at this group had skin cancer, and that they reported that the skin cancer miraculously disappeared as a result of that. Now, whether or not that's the case or not, no one's been able to examine the people or to get any medical records or determine any of that because those people refuse to come forward. So, who knows?
Looking at the phenomena over the last 30 years, does it seem to be evolving in any way? Does it seem to be getting more frequent, or the opposite?
That's kind of part of the mythology, isn't it? The part of the mythology surrounding crop circles is that, as the story goes, crop circles started showing up in the 80s. They got more advanced in the 90s, and there is this evolution that's taking place, and there's an increase in the number. Whether or not that's true or not, it's not been documented as such. And in fact, both myself and Andreas Muller, a researcher in Europe and Germany, have demonstrated that there have been many historical cases going back as far as the 1600s in which there were reports of not only circles but geometry associated with circles. So there had been pictograms that date back for centuries. And so the idea that pictograms only came about in the early 1990s is just demonstrably false. The sheer number of circles being reported has increased, but what do you attribute that to? Do you attribute that to the fact that now the media is reporting on that, whereas 50 years ago they weren't? I've talked to numerous farmers who have said they've seen circles on their property for decades, but that they never thought anything of them, and so they never reported them. And so they don't get counted, so to speak, in terms of looking at numbers year by year. One of the ones here in Ohio that we went to back in 2003 near Bainbridge, Ohio, was a large pictogram in a soybean field. And that farmer said since he was a young kid and his grandfather owned the property, they'd seen one or two circles in that field just about every single year. But they always thought it was like the wind or something that made it, so they never thought anything of it. That just seems to be typical of the kinds of circles that never get reported. So in terms of, is there an evolution or is there an increase in the number? I think both of those are on shaky ground in terms of saying that that's true. Clearly, there have been in England, for instance, a rise in the number of extravagant, huge, large pictograms in which many of them have demonstrably shown to be man-made. There may be the evolution is that the people making them may be evolving their designs, but in terms of the genuine phenomenon, I think it's hard to sketch out the understanding of that.
You mentioned how the atmosphere Indians had laid down this circle mimicking what they had seen from God, Great Spirit, whatever. Could it be that the hoaxes are actually fulfilling a natural progression that we're supposed to mimic these forms until we understand them a little more, until we can apply this geometry and this knowledge, like the magnetic anomalies for fertility?
That's an interesting philosophical question. There is a whole sort of branch of people in the crop circle community that are studying that idea. Simeon Hein, for instance, Dr. Simeon Hein has really gone down that avenue of trying to understand effects that man-made circles are having on people and whether or not anything is worth studying from that. I tend not to look down that avenue. I'll use the analogy that people for centuries going to cathedrals or going to places like Stonehenge or things like that have had spiritual experiences and have had mystical experiences, and those places are man-made. So people can clearly have spiritual experiences and interesting things happen to them inside man-made locations, and I don't think that's any different for crop circles. So they could clearly have that in a man-made crop circle. What's different is if you can demonstrate that there are ones that are clearly not man-made and there is something to be learned from them, I would rather, for lack of a better term, it's a bit like if God comes down to talk to you, do you want to go to have the priest tell you what God says, or would you rather hear God tell you directly? It's like that with crop circles. You either go to the real thing or you go to the mimicked one. I would rather spend my time and my energy looking at the real thing.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I did, but you mind if I just put on pause then?
Yeah.
We take some time. I totally forgot it. I had a good one.
We look at the approach that mainstream science and the media have towards crop circles. They're kind of similar. It's this like la 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 la, that kind of thing. Have you noticed that? And can you comment on that?
Well, certainly in the United States, the media perception of crop circles is very uneven. What you see is that in the larger mainstream sources like ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, the main big sources of information, when they come to a crop circle to look at it, they typically already have their story written. The headline is, A, it's either UFOs, or B, it's a hoax. And they get very frustrated when you say, well, have you considered alternative C, D, and E? Because they've already got their story written and it's already canned for them. Where you see better insight is with local media, particularly where a crop circle comes down. The local reporters tend to try and get the story right. It happened in their community. They want to know what's going on, and so do people. And I think that the national media tends not to want to understand it because crop circles are a very complex subject. We just spent a couple of hours talking about them, and we haven't really scratched the surface. You could literally spend a week going over the various studies that we've done to understand all of the various aspects, and you still come away with not having a complete answer. It's hard to pin that into a 20-second soundbite. So it's very difficult for the national media to tackle the story. It's similar to the approach of the scientific community. You have a group of the sort of, for lack of a better term, the Taliban in the scientific community, the fundamentalists, skeptic community that absolutely under no circumstances will even consider the thought that there is anything more to crop circles than them being man-made. And the reason for that is because those people fundamentally believe in that science has already figured everything out. And that's just not the case. There is a lot left to be undiscovered in science. And true scientists will consider the idea. The problem is that the funding for large-scale scientific undertakings comes from the people who fundamentally don't believe that there is anything to it. And it's just a problem. I got out of the academic world, and I'm now a private analyst, so I don't have to worry about an academic reputation to uphold or to chase grants or anything like that. We do it on our own dime. We do it as all volunteer, and everybody in the ICCRA does that. And that's because no one else will. And so we just try to apply as strict a scientific methodology as we can, and we try to understand the phenomenon in as many aspects as possible, because we don't believe that any one single researcher will come up with the ultimate answer. It's only through the teamwork of a number of people working on this that we've managed to make the progress that we've made. So that's where we stand.
So that's why the ICCRA does it. Why does Jeff Wilson do it? Why does he work so hard at this when you could be watching the game or just lounging, you get home from work, the last thing you want to do is tackle the hardest subject in the history of mankind? Actually,
it's a lot of fun. Just going out and meeting new people. I've been to places in the United States that most people have never even heard of. And a lot of these places are really interesting, and a lot of people are very nice and very friendly, and we get to meet new people, and I've learned a lot of things. And I continue to learn things all the time. And to me, that's fun and exciting. And it's being out there living real life rather than being an armchair researcher somewhere looking at aerial photographs and trying to, interpret what it means. Go out in the fields and you'll start to understand, the phenomenon a lot better if you're really out there.
I think this is one of my final questions. We've noticed a very odd kind of synchronicity, a kind of almost like a consciousness involved with the circles, where once you become involved, strange things start happening, information will start to fall into your lap, circles will reference your work or your travels. Have you noticed that?
I would say that most longtime researchers in the crop circle community have reported this to some extent or another. It has happened to us as well. The idea of Carl Jung's synchronicity does seem to take place. I have given a couple of lectures about why this may or may not be relevant to what we're doing. What I tend to say is that while personal synchronicities are curious and interesting and one aspect of the phenomenon, the challenge for most researchers is to not report the anecdotal synchronicity, but to try to understand the global sort of learning to be able to extend that out to other people. I could talk to you about half a dozen very quick examples of synchronicities that have happened to me that would just make your eyeballs bug out. But the issue is those are personal things that have happened, and they're anecdotal. The challenge is to try and find the insights that reach everybody. And I try to encourage other researchers to do the same, because a lot of what's being reported now about crop circles is strictly that personal anecdotal insight, as if that's something meaningful. It's meaningful to certain people, and when you look at that in the aggregate, all these researchers are experiencing this to a heightened degree as they interact with crop circles. That is a global insight, not the personal one-on-one insight. So we have to look at what did Jung mean by synchronicity, and why did he develop that theory or that idea? He based that or wrote that idea along with some physicists that dealt with quantum mechanics. And they were looking at the interaction between the quantum world and the world that our reality that we live in. And it seems as if synchronicity seems to play a role in it. Why we see a heightened sense of that in and around crop circles is a question yet to be answered. But that's sort of where is that global insight as to why is that meaningful.
Yeah, I've got one. I'm just going to stop it.
One of the differences that we see here in the United States versus what we see in England is that crop circles are actually a fairly rare phenomenon. And what I mean by rare, to put it in context, for the last 15 years or so, the average number of crop circles reported in the United States is roughly 20. According to the last United States Census, there are about 20 million farmers in the United States. So if you're a farmer, your chances of actually getting a crop circle report on your property are about 1 in a million. It's a pretty easy math equation, right? So it's a very rare phenomenon here. That may not be the circumstance in England. The amount of ground that we need to cover versus what they need to cover in England, 90+% of the crop circles in England are coming down in 3 counties. Here in the United States, the area that I personally cover in terms of the number of states that I will go out to investigate covers more than the whole of the British Isles, including Ireland combined. So the states I cover, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Kentucky, over into Iowa, Pennsylvania, into New York, down in North Carolina, Tennessee, that whole area is bigger than all of the British Isles combined. So just to be able to find them and cover them, the way in which it's done here is quite a bit different than the way in which they approach looking at circles in England. And so that's a bit more challenging here. in terms of the nature of the research that's being conducted here versus there, I've had discussions with a number of the big name researchers over there. They literally are rushing from day to day to get from one crop circle to the next. And so their immediacy of documenting it is different than ours. We will spend quite a bit more time at any individual formation doing the kind of scientific testing that we do because we have the luxury of not having to rush off to the next crop circle. We may take a full day or two to conduct all of the tests that we need to do and then spend a couple of weeks looking at that data, whereas over in England, the nature of that is just different. They may take a series of photographs and then it's on to the next one because they don't have time to do it. Now, what would be more insightful was if they cooperated and said, okay, this group, you guys handle this one, this group, you guys handle that one, and then they conduct the basic scientific research that we do so that they can cover them all, but that would take a collective effort, and there's a lot of uncooperative behavior that's taking place.
Great, I'm convinced, and we're rolling.
How we came upon the alignment insights about crop circles here in the United States was due to the fact that in 2003, there were a series of crop circles that came down across the landscape. There were 4 crop circles that came down in about a 60-mile distance, and they were approximately aligned on a straight line. In 2004, there were a series of crop circles that occurred across the state of Ohio, 5 different sites that we looked at, and they all came down in a straight line approximately. And then in 2005, there were a couple of crop circles reported down in North Carolina. And when we got down to North Carolina, Andreas Muller, the researcher in Europe, actually sent me a message about a report in West Virginia that actually had taken place in 2004 but had gone unreported. And when I put that on the map, it extended the 2004 line of circles across Ohio, but it appeared that the circles in North Carolina also seemed to align to the same site in West Virginia. And so we got the idea that if we flew along that line, could there be other circles to be found? And it turns out that that was the case. We discovered 2 additional crop circles that had been unreported by flying that alignment line. So it was a sort of a predictive tool that we were able to use. Now, when I talk about these alignments, they're general alignments. They're not, pinpoint alignments. It wasn't until later on that when we started to map the actual crop circles that we found that the crop circles themselves were aligning up one-to-one in case self-referencing each other, which is even much more accurate than these general alignments that we found originally. So that's question number 1. The second question was about what kind of crops do we see here in the United States that crop circles form in. We've actually seen a much broader range than probably anywhere else in the world. We've seen crop circles primarily in wheat. About 30% come down in wheat fields. Another 15 to 20% come down in corn or maize fields. But we also see a pretty significant number in grass fields and hay fields. A lot, about 5% in soybeans. We've seen them in canola and barley and in reeds or swamp grass. I've even been out to a couple of ice circles. So they come down in just about everything imaginable. Several years ago, there was even one that came down in an area of tree saplings where there were actually trees that came down. It actually was a geometric shape, not as just a swirled circle. It was like essentially a T, and where the two came together, the tree saplings were kind of woven together. So we see quite a range of the types of crops that crop circles appear here in the United States.
Really quickly, going back to your alignments, do you think they are pinpointing magnetic lines for us?
like ley lines,
I don't want to use the word ley because it's often misused.
right?
Magnetic lines of energy.
Well, that's the big question, right? I mean, the lines that we have seen in terms of strings of circles in a straight line across the landscape, there have been people that have raised the idea, are these showing where ley lines are, magnetic lines of force or some kind of energetic line? And that is a possibility. The two lines that we looked at of circles from 2004 across Ohio into West Virginia and 2005 across North Carolina and West Virginia actually connected in West Virginia at a right angle. And it turns out there's a researcher that has written a book called The Gaia Matrix. And he postulated in the Gaia Matrix on something that he called the Great Cross of North America. And it turns out that two arms of that cross were very, very close to these two lines of crop circles that came down. Now, it wasn't exact, but maybe his information was a little bit off, and maybe the circles were showing us really where the true cross was. I don't really know. But we don't know enough about them to understand what the true nature of them are. Going back in time, we did notice this in 1996. There were 4 circles in Indiana that came down in a straight line across about a 40-mile distance. And I wrote at the time and posted it on the Crop Circle Connector, wondering about whether or not this was some kind of ley line that was taking place. But nobody really knows what ley lines exactly are, and nobody knows what these magnetic lines of force exactly are, if they are measurable. Dowsers seem to be able to dowse them, but it's very uncertain. So that's just one aspect of it that is yet to be understood.